Political corruption knows no limits. We see it today and throughout history. But this channel does not deal with modern politics. The political corruption I want to emphasize is what happened within the halls of Congress and the War Department during the American Civil War. That war altered the country forever, setting precedents that the United States still uses to conduct itself politically, socially, and economically. One of those instances of corruption ended in the destruction of a senator's political career and the establishment of laws to guide the conduct of future politicians. Welcome to Have History Will Travel. I am your host, the Wilder Historian, and thank you for joining me for another dive into history. Casper Shubarth was a Norwegian immigrant arriving in the U.S. in 1850 and living in Providence, Rhode Island. He was a gunsmith, taking orders from the surrounding community and gaining a good reputation for his excellent work. However, the Civil War gave him an idea to get rich. In October 1861, he made his way to Washington, D.C. to see one of his representatives in the Senate, James F. Simmons, in the hope of obtaining a government contract to manufacture a rifle of his own design. He carried with him a breech-loading rifle. A few breech loaders had been developed, but the government was hesitant to adopt one for military use. Shubarth hoped his would be the exception, that if politicians saw his weapon and ammunition, that they would have to say yes and give him the green light to start production. He already had manufacturing backers waiting on his word to get started, but he had to get the contract. The Shubarth rifle improved on breech-loading rifles because it had no sliding or rubbing joint to wear out and was designed to avoid malfunction that plagued muzzle-loading muskets. The durability, he was sure, would convince politicians that it would be perfect for use against the Confederate Army. Shubarth also invented a waterproof bulb-shaped pinfire cartridge. The magazine, the Scientific American, was impressed by the weapon. They stated, "Among all the breech-loading guns that we have examined, we have seen none that impressed us more favorably than Shubarth's." The rifle could propel a bullet through 15 one-inch boards at a distance of 100 yards. He had convinced the magazine editors of its effectiveness. Now it was time to convince the government. Shubarth's backers assured him that the way to obtain a contract was to grease the wheels of government by offering kickbacks. Fortunately for him, the senator he was preparing to meet had perfected the use of greasing wheels. James F. Simmons was born in 1795 in Little Compton, Rhode Island, where he grew up working on a farm and had limited education. As a young man, he had tried to make his fortune in manufacturing. He also got involved in politics, and in 1827, Simmons was elected to the State General Assembly. Then his fellow legislatures sent him to the U.S. Senate as a Whig. He only served one term and came back home to return to business. He produced yarn and became a shady cotton trader, as some historians would describe him. In 1857, he returned to the Senate as a Republican, where he still thought as a businessman. For example, he still supported tariffs in order to help American manufacturing grow. The New York Times would later note that in the Senate debates, Simmons was a font of financial and commercial statistics, often rendering him the victor against opponents who did not agree with his deductions but could not answer his array of figures. He used much of his political power to enrich himself by directing contracts to people who gave him kickbacks for each unit sold. Luckily for both Simmons and Shubarth, the head of the Bureau of Ordnance for the War Department, Lieutenant Colonel James W. Ripley, handed out contracts willy-nilly. The Union Army was growing rapidly, and they needed weapons. The Springfield Armory could not create enough 58 caliber Model 1861 rifle muskets to supply the entire Army. Therefore, the War Department needed to contract out the manufacturing for rifled muskets. Ripley decided to stimulate the production by paying a liberal profit, giving manufacturers $20 for rifles that calculated they could make for less than 14. Ripley hoped such incentives would not only attract existing gun manufacturers, but also encourage other companies to start making weapons. Reportedly, most of the companies that answered the call weren't even in the gun business to begin with. Ripley was even willing to make deals with entrepreneurs who didn't have factories of any sort. Casper Shubarth was one of those men. He had backers who agreed to convert their factory to making weapons once he got the contract. However, when Simmons set up the meeting between Shubarth and Ripley, the War Department had zero interest in giving a contract for the Shubarth rifle. They wanted the Springfield Model 1861. Dejected, Shubarth returned home, but probably through Simmons' influence, Ripley wrote to Shubarth and offered him a contract to make 20,000 Springfield Model 1861 rifle muskets for $20 per musket, the first 1,000 of which would be due by January 1862. An orally agreed upon part of the contract was that Simmons would receive a kickback of 5% for each musket, or $1 per musket delivered. Shubarth's original backers refused to work with him because making 20,000 muskets wouldn't pay for the cost of investment to convert their factories over to making them. So Ripley agreed to increase the number by 30,000, but by the time that deal was solidified, his backers had pulled away entirely. Now the small-scale gunsmith had an order for 50,000 muskets and no factory to make them. Shubarth finally came up with a plan. The various parts of the weapons would be made by different companies. For example, the stocks would come from New York City, and the mountings would come from Connecticut. Once all the parts were shipped to him, he himself would put them together and ship them to the War Department. Shubarth had hit many snags in attempting to get a contract for making weapons, but one of his biggest obstacles emerged in January 1862 when Lincoln replaced Secretary of War Simon Cameron with Edwin Stanton. Cameron had been alleged to have taken part in numerous corruption scandals, but he was also incompetent. His organization skills were subpar, and his oversight of the War Department led to the explosion of contracts sent to unreliable contractors. When Edwin Stanton entered the War Department, he quickly whipped things into shape. Stanton took an especially hard look at the government's 36 outstanding contracts for over 1 million Model 1861 muskets. At the time, that number was more than twice as many as the Union Army estimated it would need, and to many it seemed like a glaring example of waste and shady dealings. As Shubarth fell way behind in his production, and Stanton cracked down on bad contracts, Shubarth and Simmons were summoned to appear at a hearing by the Commission on Ordnance Contracts. Both men were candid about the negotiations and kickbacks expected by Simmons. The senator openly admitted to taking bribes and kickbacks for government contracts. That may seem surprising, but as the Commission noted in its June 17, 1862 report, what they had done wasn't actually illegal at the time. An 1808 statute barred members of Congress from taking part in a governmental contract, but that law didn't appear to apply to Simmons, since his agreements had been with Shubarth and his backers, not the War Department. The Commission found Shubarth innocent of any wrongdoing, and chalked it up to him being an immigrant that he was not intimately aware of governmental processes. The day after the Commission released its report, Congress passed a law against any member of Congress accepting fees for obtaining contracts. For Simmons, the Senate Judiciary Committee debated but ultimately threw it back to the full Senate to make a ruling on what to do with the Rhode Island senator. His fellow senators all agreed that what he had done was wrong and inexcusable, but before they could issue a ruling, Simmons resigned under a cloud of corruption. He would return to his businesses and pass away 2 years later. This scandal had incredible significance to American history, because it, in part, led to the False Claims Act, or more commonly known as Lincoln's Law. The new law provided criminal penalties for defense fraud and allowed whistleblowers to bring suits against corrupt military suppliers and enable them to collect a portion of the amount that the government recovered in the case. Abraham Lincoln stated, "Worse than traitors in arms are the men that pretend loyalty to the flag, feast and fatten on the misfortunes of the nation, while patriotic blood is crimsoning the plains of the South, and their countrymen are moldering in the dust." Although the number of rifles were reduced, Shubarth was never able to fully satisfy the contract. Only the first 500 had his name stamped on them, which makes them very valuable to collectors today. When he was unable to meet the contract, it expired, and his hopes of being a big-time arms seller was dashed. He would eventually work in the steel industry in the Northeast and became a prosperous man, living out his last years in a 3-story home in Newark, New Jersey, and passed away in 1908, responsible for one of the most significant laws in American history. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed this journey into history and learned something new. Thank you all again, and have a great day.
Historian, historian, where do you roam? Historian, historian, far, far from home. Have history will travel reads the card of a man, a professor with knowledge in the heartland. To educate the world is his mission. A professor of fortune is a man called historian. Historian.